Courts typically, when they see a politically charged decision being made by a state legislature or even the federal legislature, will defer federal questions for the political bodies. They won't enter into the fight. Okay? So we can't rely on the courts to come in and sort of save the districts that are going to be affected by this map redraw. Okay, the 18th congressional district is where a lot of people in Houston are assigned and live inside of that district. It's had minority representation for probably the last 35 years. Sheila Jackson Lee is the most recent congresswoman to pass away. Right after her, Mayor Sylvester Turner took over. And then it turns out he had some personal issues and he ended up dying, I think, less than a year after he took the seat. And I think Craig Washington had it before Sheila Jackson Lee. So at the end of the day, there's been black representation in the 18th congressional district for, I would say the last 35, 45 years at a minimum. Okay. And even before that. Okay. How is it we're in 2025 and these sort of attacks on minority communities keep happening? Well, number one, those attacks are never going to stop. But number two, our communities, someone did a study about how long does a dollar stay in relevant American communities. Okay, they went and they studied the black community, they studied Southeast Asian community, they studied the white community, the Asian community, the Hispanic community. And on average, and this could be for any reason, economic de-empowerment, racism, whatever reason that you want to have, but the black dollar stays in the black community for about 6 hours. Okay? That means that as soon as we are touching our dollars, almost immediately before the day is up, before the sun sets, we're thinking about sending it outside of our community. Okay. Now, there are a lot of attacks on African Americans in this country. But when we attack ourselves in that way, it sort of rings a little bit different. In the Southeast Asian community, the dollar stays in their community for 29 days before it leaves. 29 days. And that was the longest period of time where the dollar stayed in that community before it went to a business or a vendor outside of the community. Okay? So black economic empowerment has to be studied, evaluated, and reevaluated by constituents and leaders, because that's how you lead to a disenfranchisement problem, which is what's on the table right now. And I don't think the courts are going to save anybody from this, to be honest. It's a political question. As long as these maps aren't drawn in an overtly racial way, they can sort of dilute the black vote, but they won't eliminate the black vote, which would be racist. That might get court protection. But I think that, these Republicans have shown that they can be very cunning. They know the president has appointed multiple federal judges now. And I think he may go down as appointing more federal judges during his presidency than any other president in history. And so we know that eventually things may end up in Washington, D.C. at the Supreme Court. And we know that most of those justices are conservative. You can't rely on conservative justices to come and save a racial minority, especially one that's not voting in their party or part of their party. You just can't expect that. So black economic empowerment is something that definitely has to be studied. Why is the money in our community, almost as soon as it touches our hands leaving before the sun sets that day. That's a big problem. The other issue that we have to look at is our leaders and the things that they have done since we elect them. Sometimes folks will continue to elect someone out of purely being comfortable with that person, not really putting them under the microscope to see, well, what did you bring into the community? If you want to be my city councilwoman, what's happening with the bars and nightclubs that are in Third Ward that all the residents are complaining about? Um, why do we keep electing people who get the power, get the job, and then literally just wait around until the next election before they come back and try to court the community for the vote again without really sending dollars into that community? Okay. And I mean, no disrespect, but I mean, Sheila Jackson Lee was also part of this. The 18th congressional district didn't get anything but metro jobs with her. There was all kinds of investment that people were interested in, specifically people of color were interested in investing in that community. But the only thing that actually came out of living in the 18th was you got expanded metro lines, you got metro expansion, and you got all the metro jobs, pouring into that community. Nothing else. Okay. You go to parts of the 18th district and it's like a desert. You can't find a grocery store. You can find plenty of low income housing, but you can't find the things that make a community great. You can find plenty of liquor stores, but you can't find the HEB, And so, why do we keep electing people who do not enrich the districts that they come from? Because that's what every other congressperson is trying to do. They're like 495 people in the House of Representatives. The other 494 of them are sending money back home. Why is only money for public transport being sent back to the 18th? There was really no growth economically for the 18th for the last 20 or 30 years. And now, because of where it's located in Houston, it is right outside downtown. It is prime real estate. And I think a study should be done on who owns all that land. Because, I mean, I suspect it may not be all black owned. There are a lot of black people who live there. But it may actually be owned by different communities. And that's the nature of neighborhoods. That's not just the 18th. But we have to look at economic empowerment and our leaders. Okay, what can Texas leaders do? Well, they have to have a quorum in the state house to do any of this. There has to be a quorum. If they don't have enough people there, they can take a vote all they want. Legally, it won't stick. This redistricting won't become law. But there's almost no one who has the stomach or the chutzpah to want to leave the state, leave the assembly, so that there can't be a quorum. It may not eliminate what's going to happen, but it may slow down what's going to happen significantly. Okay? So you have to be, you almost have to be a political gangster when you get proposals like this coming up. Because I've talked to people who are part of the Texas Black Democratic Caucus, and there is no concrete plan. Everybody's running around with their own plan, but there's no concrete plan to stop this or slow it down. Okay? So we have to look at our local leaders, city council, our mayors, our state house leaders, our state senate leaders, and ask ourselves why we keep sending these people back if the BS comes down the pipe and you can sit there and vote no, but you're not willing to be gangster about it. The Republicans are being gangsters. They're going to force this. This has a 95% chance of becoming law. Now, there apparently are, first they were talking about creating 5 districts, but apparently there's 7 or maybe up to even 10 maps that this map drawer that the Republicans have hired that he has. And we don't know what all those maps look like. But he can come up with some race blind or race neutral mapping that still has the same effect of diluting the black vote, which means it's probably going to pass muster with the courts when somebody decides to sue about this, because there is going to be a lot of litigation. But and that's another thing. There's no real litigation strategy here. I'm a litigator. When you go to court, you want to have a strategy. You want to know if your opponent does X, you're going to do Y. If they're going to do A, you need to do B. Here, there's just these leaders are relying on nonprofits to come in after the fact to challenge the gerrymandering maps, and they've done that before, some with success, most with no success. But because they've done it before, they're gonna be asked to do it again, and that's fine. But I haven't seen any private black or brown law firms brought on board to really strategize, what's going on. What are some things that can happen before the vote, during the vote, after the vote? How is it going to be attacked, and why are we going to attack it in that way? No one has given an assessment of that. It's just we're going to rely on the NAACP and several other nonprofits to do what they always do, and that's important work. I'm not discounting that work, but they come in after the fact, after the damage is done, and then they rely on conservative, Republican-appointed judges to save them against their own party who put them in their job. I just think the 95% chance that's not going to happen. Okay? So, key decisions. Courts can allow majority-minority districts under the Voting Rights Act Section 2. But they're going to look to see whether those maps are quote-unquote narrowly tailored, and race can't be the dominant factor, which goes back to what I said before, is there are ways that you can dilute the black vote without making race the dominant factor. It's not very difficult to do. So the 18th Congressional District in Houston is going to be affected by this. The 9th Congressional District and several districts in South Texas are going to face significant dilution of their black and brown voting power if something isn't done. And that's really what the genesis of the podcast is what can we do before the vote hits? Some people are having rallies. Some people are having very large meetings to protest. They're disrupting the meetings of local city councils and things like that. That's important. You can do that in America. You have the right to petition your government, but that's not the state house. That's not the actual body who's going to be making the decision. They're making their voices heard, which is important, but ultimately you have to make the decision makers hear your voice. And the decision makers are in Austin. So you can walk out. That'll signal some strong opposition. You've got former senatorial candidate Beto O'Rourke and Representative Al Green. They've been present at some marches. But going forward, that is all about getting the word out. That's not actually going to promote a substantive change. The blue party, the Democrats, are going to have to engage some political maneuvering. That's the only way. I think at this point, the vote can be slowed down But I don't think that, and maybe it can be slowed down long enough to eliminate it another way. But I don't think that marching, having rallies, um, getting on TV, even doing podcasts by itself, that's not really gonna stop anybody. Okay, it's going to be a political reality very, very soon. So if we can get to a point, or in America, where we have local leaders who bring economic dollars into the community, you're going to empower black and brown communities economically. That turns into asset acquisition. Okay? When we own all the stores, when we own all the land in our communities, that translates to political power. Economic power does not equate with political power, nor does economic power immediately translate over to political power. Why? Because you have plenty of rich people out there who have absolutely no power whatsoever. They have no political power. You have plenty of folks out there that have 6, 7 figure incomes. And if they get upset with where they are, they can afford to just move somewhere else. They don't need to change anything politically. But take the case of someone who is economically empowered plus asset empowered. They have substantial assets in a particular district. Then they're going to be forced to make an investment into the local political leadership to make sure that their vote is not diluted and their vote's always going to be heard. So what's the call to action? I mean, what can you do? What can I do as not being the decision makers, as being regular citizens? What can we do? First, I think we can challenge ourselves. Before we reach outward, we need to look inward. And we need to challenge ourselves to question why it is we do things the way we have always done things. Because the world is changing, political maneuvers are changing, presidents change. We need to change. And we need to put folks forward, and we need to challenge ourselves to put leaders forward who aren't just talking the talk, but who are actually walking the walk. And what's the walk? They are empowering their community economically on a day-to-day basis, a week-to-week basis, and it's measurable. All of this is measurable. Empowering your community. Something more than, jobs at the public transit authority. Something that you can, whether it's technology, oil and gas, healthcare, attracting those dollars into the community so that the locals profit. We need to challenge ourselves to have leaders that do that. The second thing that we can do is, in addition to the rallies, the marches, the political gatherings, we need to petition our local leaders that, hey, if you're going to be in Austin on July whatever, or August whenever this vote comes up for this redistricting, if you're there and all you're going to do is vote no, we're going to primary your ass. That's it. You don't need to be there. Okay? You need to create a coalition of rebels and not be there. Because if there's no quorum, it can't move forward. But if you're there and you're just voting no, it's almost like a vote for yes, because it's going to move forward and they do have the votes to get this done. And once it's done, the only savior is either you have the Texas governor step in the way, which I don't think that's likely to happen, or a court steps into the way. 95% that's not going to happen. If this thing is done right and it's done in a racially neutral way, it doesn't matter if the effect is racist. The means have to be race neutral. Otherwise, the courts have every reason to just stay out of it. And if we don't like that, we can appeal it to the Court of Appeals in New Orleans. And if we don't like that decision, we can appeal it to the Supreme Court. But who's sitting on the Supreme Court? It's not very many people appointed by President Obama. you know, Most of those folks who are sitting there were appointed by a Republican president. And I think that they're going to back that agenda. We need to expect them to back that agenda. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I just think that um, there are there are effective ways to get this thing done and to get it delayed right now. But there's no accountability in the Democratic Party right now. You get elected, you get the votes, you get on social media, you get a following, you attend multiple events, you get the power, and then by doing nothing, it really is just a nod to the status quo, which the people elected you to bring about change. They didn't send you to the courthouse or to the state house to keep the status quo. They need change, and they need to see change in their life during the term, not just when it's time to get reelected, because there are promises everywhere. Democrats make promises all the time. You don't like something, we'll give you a government program for it. You want to go speak Spanish on the moon, we'll create a government program for that. Who's going to pay for that? You. Okay? Everything doesn't need a government program. Cutting costs. That's not an enemy of the people, okay? But not doing things for the people, and in fact actively working against the people by showing up because you feel like, hey, I just have to show up for XYZ and I'm going to vote no, knowing full well that that's not going to change anything for your district. I think that is an injury to the people. So it's an evolving conversation. If you lived or live in any of these affected districts, consider checking your voter representation and support your advocacy groups who are pushing for fair maps, because there are all kinds of alternative maps being proposed. But the only maps that are likely to be considered are the ones that come out of this vote. You have to stay informed. You have to get involved, and it's a political beast. Today it could be a loss, but tomorrow you could still win the war. But everything starts with holding yourself accountable. That's why we started this podcast. That's why to the leaders out there, to the politicians, we're judging you. We see you. We're watching every move that you make, and we're judging you. And I don't think any of that's gonna stop anytime soon.